Hello and welcome to this video about how long it takes to learn each language. Now, this is a question that doesn't actually have a set answer, but we'll look in detail as to why that is in this video. So yeah, it's a common question people ask, especially when they're starting out wanting to learn a language. How long does it take to learn each language? But in order to give a detailed and sufficiently nuanced answer to that question, it's important to dispel some of the common misconceptions out there about language learning. So, one of these is that some languages are more difficult to learn than others. Now, in a general sense, languages are not more inherently difficult than another, really, because we all learn our first languages as children. Whether you're Japanese, you learn Japanese as a child growing up in Japan, or you're an English speaker who learned English as a child growing up in the UK or the US, South Africa, Australia, etc. So languages aren't inherently more difficult than another. And just to reinforce that point, actually, people often English speakers will often notice the Japanese writing system or the Chinese writing system and think it looks incredibly complicated compared to, say, using an alphabet like in English. But Japanese school children, Chinese school children, will take years at school to learn their writing systems, but so do we in English-speaking countries. We spend years at school improving our spelling and our vocabulary, etc. So when you actually think about it, it's all very similar, and languages aren't inherently more difficult than another. Where they are, or where difficulty does come into the picture, is when assessing a language relative to your first language. So of course, some languages, if you're say English is your first language, other languages will be more difficult to learn than other languages based on, how similar or different they are from English in that example. So when thinking about difficulty, I'd recommend thinking about degree of similarity or degree of difference instead of difficulty per se. Now, another sort of misconception about language learning is implied by the question itself: how long does it take to learn each language? Because actually there's always more of a language to learn, and this is one of the joys of learning languages. There's always more to learn. No matter whether you get to an intermediate or advanced level, there's always more to learn, and that's a great thing. Now, of course, we can, in order to answer the question, how long does it take to learn a language, what we can do is we can set a certain level in any language that we have in mind. So in this case, we'll think of proficiency, which, judging by the CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, would be C1 or C2, the highest bands. That would be proficiency. So when answering the question, how long does it take to learn a language, let's have in mind, to reach a level of proficiency in a given language. Now, in terms of how long does it take to learn a language, in general, this, in and of itself, it's not a very helpful question, because your learning process will be unique to you. Everyone has their own unique journey when learning a language, and an array of factors will contribute to that: your situation, your previous experience learning languages, if any, your goals, your interests, your motivation, your free time, all sorts of things, as well as external factors, will contribute to how long it takes you. So there's no set way in that sense, but what we can give more of an answer for, although it would still be very approximate, is assessing how long it takes to learn a language in relation to other languages. So for example, if English is your first language, all things being equal, it will take you less time to learn Norwegian or French than it would to learn German, just as it will take you less time to learn German than it would, say, Vietnamese or Russian. just as it will probably take you less time to learn Vietnamese or Russian than it would to learn, say, Mandarin Chinese or Japanese, for example. And again, that's a general rule. It won't always be the case because, as I say, your learning journey will be unique to you. Now, in terms of assessing the relative time it would take to learn each language, a very useful resource, although again, this isn't to endorse their activities, but a useful resource is the Foreign Service Institute of the United States, because over their many years of training diplomats and so on in foreign languages, they've built up a lot of data and a lot of knowledge of how long it usually takes their students to reach proficiency in the languages they're training them in, to work abroad on behalf of the USA. So previously, when I've come across the FSI language categories, some years ago, they divided it into 5 categories, but looking at their website recently, it seems they put it into 4 categories now. So you've got Category 1, Category 2, Category 3 and Category 4, and we'll take a look at those in just a moment. So Category 1 being the easiest in inverted commas, or as I say, a better way of thinking of that, the most similar to English, and progressively to Category 4 being the ones with least similarity with English and therefore taking longer to learn, generally speaking. Now, in terms of how learning estimates are calculated by the FSI, as I say, a lot of it is based on their own data from years of training people in foreign languages, and they use a proficiency standard. So all of the times they mention, because they mention specific times and weeks, hours, weeks for reaching proficiency in certain languages, are based on reaching that level of proficiency in a given language. Now, they provide very specific or fairly specific numbers or sometimes ranges of the amount of hours and weeks they think it takes to learn languages in each category based on their own data and years of doing this. Now, a final thing worth considering when bearing all this in mind is that when the Foreign Service Institute train people in these languages, these are very intensive courses they're on. I think most recently on their website it says an average week, a typical week, would be 23 hours of in-class study time and 17 hours of self-study. And then from there they base their estimates for each category. So we'll take a look at those now. So they have Category 1, so these are the languages with the least amount of differences with English, a lot of similarities with English, or closely related to English as language families or language branches of families. They think, based on their experience and data training people, it takes 24 to 30 weeks or 552 to 690 class hours to train someone to proficiency, so a very high level in Spanish or Swedish or Norwegian, Dutch, French, Italian, Portuguese, languages like that are Germanic languages or Romance languages that are very closely related to English or have a lot of shared vocabulary with English. Now, as you may have guessed from what I've been saying so far, these numbers and ranges given by the FSI, take them with a pinch of salt for several reasons. One is that these numbers are based on they're estimates, but they're also based on a very specific, intense learning approach that they do at the Foreign Service Institute for training people in these foreign languages. Your learning process will likely look very much different, especially if it's, you're learning it by yourself. But that isn't to say that you can't learn these languages at a similar pace or faster than the Foreign Service Institute mentioned. As that might sound ridiculous at first, but actually, you can go about ways of learning languages to learn them very effectively and in an enjoyable way. You don't have to be taught a language in terms of, in a classroom to learn a language. Now, as I say, what are useful about these estimates is they do give us a general sense of how long it takes to learn each language in relation to each one. So even though these, the number of weeks and number of class hours BFSI mentions here aren't really useful in and of themselves, where they are useful is it does give us a general sense that, for example, the Category 2 languages like Swahili, Indonesian, German will usually take longer to learn than, say, Spanish, French, Swedish, etc., because they have more differences with English, less in common with English. But the reason they're Category 2 and, say, not Category 3, 4 will be that they do have some features which don't feel too unfamiliar to English speakers. Now, Category 2 doesn't have many languages in. When I most recently checked it, Swahili, Indonesian, German, Malay, depending on how you define Indonesian, Malay, etc., but not many more than that off the top of my head. Now, Category 3 is the biggest category, got lots of languages, and the FSI estimates these would take, a little bit longer than the Category 2 languages, and they list loads of languages in this category, and they aren't exhaustive lists as well, because obviously there's so many languages in the world, but they list like Vietnamese, Lao, Khmer, Hindi, Turkish, Russian, Armenian, Nepali, Georgian, Uzbek, Kazakh, Kyrgyz, I think Mongolian, loads and loads of languages in that Category 3. Now we'll look at why languages have been put in certain categories by the FSI in more detail shortly, but the fundamental reason from their perspective is that in their experience and their data, these groups of languages take more or less time to learn than the other groups of languages, which is a fair enough assessment to make as a general rule, to give us a general idea of how much longer it will take to learn one language than another. Now the final category, Category 4, these languages have very little similarities with English, lots of differences to get used to, so like Mandarin Chinese, Cantonese, Japanese, Arabic. The FSI mentions Korean as well, but there aren't many languages they list in this category. Those are the main ones, and there might be all of them actually off the top of my head. But according to the Foreign Service Institute, these languages take twice as long to reach proficiency in as the Category 3 languages. Now, we'll get into debates about how accurate that is shortly, but just remember, take these with a pinch of salt. They're just interesting and vaguely useful markers as approximations of how certain languages will take longer to learn than others based on their differences with English. And yeah, again, quick caveat, remember everyone's language learning journey is unique to them. It'll be unique to you, and you may find that you're able to learn a language in Category 3 faster than Category 2, for example, or various combinations like that. So yeah, just take it with a pinch of salt. Now, as I said, the estimates are based on reaching a level of proficiency, their intense learning approach, and the consistent evaluation they do at the FSI. But that is a very specific learning situation relevant to the FSI itself. It's not really applicable to yourself and many other people watching this. So, as I say, take it with a pinch of salt. Now, just before we look at the categories in more detail, I just want to mention a quick tip for, if you are learning any of these languages or wondering how long it might take you to learn a language. I don't recommend thinking in terms of hours and weeks personally. If you find that helpful, then go for it, but I wouldn't recommend it if you're unsure whether it's helpful or not. But just as a quick exercise in motivation and getting the most out of your routine for learning a language, think about how you could use empty time, which is referring to the time we all spend in a day, waiting to do something. Like, you've got 5-10 minutes before your shifts start and you scroll through your phone, or you're waiting for the train or bus home from work and you're looking at your phone, stuff like that, where all you do is sort of just random scrolling, not really doing anything. If you take that empty time each day and apply it to the language you're learning, and say, as a conservative estimate, it was 1 hour a day at that time, because you'll be surprised how much time we all spend on our screens if you check the stats on your phone. But say it was 1 hour a day. That's 7 hours a week, 30 hours a month, 365 hours a year as a general estimate that you could be putting towards learning a language. Now, as I say, I don't recommend literally thinking in terms of hours and weeks, in terms of how long it would take you to learn a language. I don't think it's particularly helpful, but regardless of whether you think in that way or not, it's true that if you had, just as an example, 365 hours a year that you spend just randomly scrolling on your phone doing nothing, if you use that time for learning a language, be it listening to podcasts or reading an article or learning some new phrases, then that's 365 more hours a year pushing you further towards reaching your goals, learning a language. So worth bearing that in mind. And as I say, I mention it here because the FSI makes a thing of hours it takes to learn a language. Well, here's potentially a lot of extra hours you can find for your language learning goals, which are easy to implement. You don't need to take away any time from other aspects of your life. This is time that's empty, that you're not really using at all at the moment. Now, Category 1 languages, we won't go into too much detail on each one because you could be here all day talking about the details of each one, but the Category 1 languages, as I said, Dutch, French, Dutch, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Catalan, Danish, languages that are very closely related to English and have a lot of shared vocabulary. That's why they're easier. And of course, they all have very similar alphabets as well. They've got a lot in common with English, and so it takes less time to learn them compared to languages that have less in common with English. Now, Category 2 languages, as I mentioned, these, there aren't many languages listed in this category by the Foreign Service Institute. It's Swahili, Indonesian, Malay, and German, really, the main ones. And German is put in Category 2 by them as opposed to Category 1 because its grammar is renowned for being a bit more complex than English grammar, or feels complex anyway to an English speaker. And for Indonesian and Swahili, obviously they don't have many loan words from English or European languages. I mean, they have some. Indonesian has some Dutch and English loanwords, but mostly their vocabulary isn't similar to English, but their pronunciation is very phonetic. So, and they have the same, have similar alphabet to English, or same alphabet. So they have phonetic pronunciation where each letter is pronounced as it sounds. So that makes that part of those languages fairly easy to learn for English speakers because it's quite familiar. And so, they take longer to learn than the Category 1 languages, but still quite familiar, so they don't take as long as languages with more differences with English. Now, Category 3 is where the FSI estimates start to get very controversial with people because, they list, a certain amount of weeks and hours it takes to learn these, but these languages all represent their own unique challenges and so on. So, if we take, for example, Khmer and Lao, Khmer has its own unique script, Lao has its own unique script, but Lao is also a tonal language, which is a big difference from English. Khmer is not a tonal language. So, based on that, you'd say that Lao has slightly more differences with English, but according to the Foreign Service Institute, they'd both take, the same amount of time based on both being in Category 3. Now, to be fair, it's worth remembering these categories are, estimates. They're not totally exact, even though they do list exact numbers at times. And each of these languages will take different amounts of times to learn to proficiency for different people based on all sorts of factors. Like I said, your situation, your goals, your experience. For example, if you're learning Lao, if you've already learned Vietnamese, then which is also a tonal language, then the tonal aspect of Lao will feel more familiar, and so it will take less time than it might have done. Likewise, if you've learned Thai, which is also a tonal language but also very closely related to Lao, they'll have a lot of shared vocabulary as well, so it'll take even less time. So it all depends on many factors, including any other languages your goals, interests, and how much free time you have, etc. And also, what resources you have available, online, because some languages have more content, more learning resources available than others as well. So many factors go into this. So don't, if you're looking at category 3 and thinking this seems a bit ridiculous, they've got loads of unique languages in there but in the same category, take it with a pinch of salt. What matters really is that these languages will usually take longer to learn than the category 2 and category 1 languages. So as I said, like Hindi, Russian as well, Nepali, Georgian, Albanian, all sorts of languages in that category 3. Now category 4, there aren't many languages listed in category 4. It's mainly Mandarin, Chinese, Cantonese, Japanese, Korean, Arabic off the top of my head. I don't think there are any others, but might be wrong. But certainly these are the main ones in that category, if not the only ones. Japanese, Mandarin, for both, they're in this category because they've got very different writing systems to English, and they're also Japanese is in there because its grammar can seem very complex to English speakers as well, and Mandarin because it's a tonal language, which is another big difference from English. Likewise, Cantonese, the writing system, and also being a tonal language, it's got even more tones than Mandarin, and even more tones than Vietnamese, for example. And Korean, its writing system is different to English, but its alphabet, the Korean alphabet, which was created in, off the top of my head, I think it was the 15th century, so the 1400s, and it's renowned for being a really good alphabet in the sense it makes a lot of sense and relates to the position of the tongue and the mouth when you're making certain sounds, I think, as far as I'm aware. And so it's a very practical alphabet, and estimates depend on who you ask, but can take anywhere between a few hours to a few days to learn. So not as complicated a writing system as, for English speakers, not as complicated a writing system as Japanese or Chinese languages, but it's still in category 4 according to the FSI because it also has quite a complicated grammar system compared to English, or for English speakers. But again, as I say, you could debate these categories. They're only approximations. Personally, I would wonder whether Vietnamese would be or take longer to learn than Korean, perhaps, but it would depend on your learning preferences. I personally found, like many people, when I started learning Mandarin and learning Vietnamese, the tones, took some getting used to. I was more than happy to take on that challenge, but it did take some getting used to. Whereas I think I'd find with, learning the Korean alphabet, it wouldn't take too long apparently, and if you learn languages in a certain way, by focusing on learning whole phrases and sentences, then grammar will take care of itself more. You don't necessarily have to study grammar in isolation if you don't want to. So I think with that in mind, people could debate whether Vietnamese or Korean might feel more different to English or not, and therefore take a bit longer to learn. But as I say, it will depend on your situation. Everyone's language learning journey will be unique to them. And Arabic, again, different script to English, and grammar apparently can be a bit complicated for English speakers, so that's why that's in there. But again, I'm sure you'll be thinking, and many people will have experience where learning these languages in category 4 would have taken them different amounts of time. So again, take it with a pinch of salt and think more in terms of, generally speaking, these languages will probably take longer to learn than category 3 languages, which take longer to learn usually than category 2 languages, and so on. Now, to give some real examples of how long it might take to learn languages, I thought I'd mention my personal experience of how long it took me to learn different languages. As I say, this is just one example. Everyone's learning journey will be unique, but just to give you a sense of how it can vary and what your learning journey might be for some of these languages as well. Now, just quickly before I go into that, I'll just quickly mention how to learn any language. I cover this in other videos, so I won't go into great detail, but the fundamental principles for learning any language are passive learning, active learning, and practice. So passive learning is your immersion in the language, where you can attach it to things you already do, like your commute, cooking, cleaning, or exercise. Active learning is where you learn whole phrases, whole sentences, but doesn't require as much time as passive learning, your immersion, in terms of on a daily basis, I mean. And practice is having conversations with speakers of the language you're learning. Now, within those fundamental principles, you can be as creative as you want to be, use resources you enjoy, techniques you enjoy. As long as they follow those principles, you'll be on the right track. Now, my experience learning Romance languages was, I learnt French at school, but could only read it to an okay level after doing it for A-level, but I couldn't really understand it when I listened to it or speak it fluently. But I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to study 2 semesters at the Sorbonne as a study abroad year, which was studying history but taught in French. So during that process, my French improved a lot just through the process itself. And from then, it showed me how to learn languages, the principles I mentioned, and I applied this to learning Spanish. So I learnt Spanish using a French book called Assamil, or a French company called Assamil who had a book in French for learning Spanish. That way I could sustain and improve my French whilst learning Spanish, and the similarities between the 2 languages in terms of vocabulary and grammar to a certain extent meant that I could make rapid progress learning Spanish. So I was able to do the active learning for Spanish in a couple of months, and then I was able to, read Spanish sources for dissertation research and stuff, and work of Spanish historians as well. Like you see there, El Socialista, researching fascism in the 1930s. So yeah, that just took a couple of months of active learning for my reading level to get to there. My listening made good progress with the passive learning I was doing, but that was something that wasn't as much of a priority at the time because I was in not a rush, but wanting to push on so I could conduct dissertation research in my final year of university. I then did the same for learning Portuguese. I used the Spanish version of Assamil's book for learning Brazilian Portuguese, or Portuguese. And again, I was able to make rapid progress in less than a few months, completing the Assamil book and being able to read Portuguese. And again, my listening was a more longer term process with that. But because of the similarities in those languages, my reading level was able to make very fast progress because they have so much shared vocabulary. And yeah, I did the same with Italian and Catalan, using the Romance languages together to make very fast progress, or relatively fast progress, in them for the purpose of doing dissertation research. And after that, I was able to chip away with my passive learning to improve my listening in those languages. So, yeah, as I said, this is the book I used, Assamil, for learning Spanish through French. You see the Spanish on the left, French on the right. The same conversation to compare and make fast progress. Now, my experience learning Mandarin Chinese was obviously very different because it's got very little in common with English, and I, hadn't learned, say, Cantonese beforehand. It was my first time learning Chinese characters, so, when learning Mandarin Chinese, it was the first time I'd come into contact with all the differences that set apart Mandarin Chinese from English. But for example, just before I talk about my experience with it, if say you're a Cantonese speaker or have relatives who speak Cantonese and you therefore are at least familiar to a point with Cantonese, then starting a language like Mandarin Chinese may feel less of a jump than it would if you haven't got that experience. So it all depends, as I say. But anyway, learning Chinese characters was something I tackled straight away. I used a book called Remembering the Hansa by Heisig and Richardson off the top of my head. I found it really useful. There's debate about the best way to go about learning Chinese characters, but I really enjoyed their book. It was hard work over a period of... I remember I tried it first and then for like about a month, but then it was very busy with other stuff and used that interruption to start again and refine my approach using the book to use it more effectively when I started over. And then it took me, I think, off the top of my head, I think it was like 3 months of really focused work, each day, working through it, learning a lot of characters each day. I won't go into more detail about it now, but yeah, that's not to say that, I could memorize and write out the 3,000 most common characters it covers, from then on, but it made me familiar with loads of Chinese characters to the point where, I was comfortable with stroke order, the order you write the strokes of the characters. When I was immersing in Chinese and actively learning Chinese, it meant that a lot of the characters were familiar, they weren't new to me. And so it was a great platform for the rest of the learning process. Now, learning Pinyin as well, which is the Romanized script for, transcribing the sounds of Chinese words, Chinese characters. At first, for some people that can feel like an extra thing they have to learn, but it's actually a huge help for the learning process and for improving your Chinese pronunciation. And it doesn't take long to get familiar with, compared to learning the characters anyway. And tones and pronunciation is a big change for an English speaker. I found my first time learning a tonal language. But the thing with stuff like that, two things. One, remember what I said about how there's always more of a language to learn, so don't be too worried or hung up about having to, think, when can you complete tones in inverted commas? Stuff doesn't really work like that in language learning. And also, I've seen a video before of someone on YouTube talking about, they have a PhD, I think, where they were, the language of instruction was Chinese. So their Chinese is obviously excellent, very high level, but they said they still have to take time sometimes just to work on their tones a bit, sharpen up their tones, make them more accurate. So tones are an ongoing process. So it's perhaps not worth dwelling too much on, literally how much time it would take to learn that stuff. You can obviously focus on it and get yourself to a point where your tones are at a decent level, but I say the time it takes will vary from person to person. I found that my pronunciation was pretty good in Chinese early on because of following the key principles of language learning, like passive learning, active learning, and practice. And in terms of my tones, at that time, because I was busy with other stuff, I took quite not hands-off approach, because I was very much conscious of wanting to speak with accurate tones, but I didn't do deliberate drills to train my tones that often. I'm mostly just in learning whole phrases and practicing saying those phrases and imitating how first language speakers would say those phrases. My tones would improve naturally through that. What I would recommend is, if you are learning a tonal language, do take some time to do drills with the tones to really make it more familiar to you, because it will help. Now, the biggest challenge I found with learning Mandarin Chinese was finding enough time, and this is why I wanted to talk about my experience learning Mandarin Chinese, because this element of it is very relevant to the question, how long does it take to learn each language? Because my personal experience learning Mandarin Chinese has been that, if I'd been able to continue what I'd been doing learning Mandarin Chinese uninterrupted, in terms of not taking big breaks from learning the language over months or even years at times, then in terms of the actual time it would have taken me to reach proficiency in Mandarin Chinese, I think it would have taken anywhere between a year to 2 years, depending on, lots of factors within that, like how much free time I had within that sustained period of learning it. So that's based on how I felt during the times I actually could dedicate time to learning Mandarin Chinese in my spare time. And obviously that's to reach a level of proficiency, but as I said, always more to learn, especially with Mandarin Chinese. Now, in reality, with learning Mandarin Chinese, I've found that there's been long periods since I started learning it, about 5 years ago, where I haven't had time to learn Mandarin Chinese, and so the progress I make will be eroded to some extent. And I find that especially the case with Mandarin Chinese, because it is so different to English, and thinking particularly of the characters here and to a lesser extent the tones. When, for example, I've had times where I felt I've been making really good progress and getting to, an intermediate level and towards an upper intermediate level, there'll have then been like months, even years at times, where I don't have time to learn Mandarin Chinese because of other work or study commitments. And so when I then eventually have time to come back to learning Mandarin Chinese, I find that I'm back towards a sort of lower intermediate level and having to like rebuild again to get to upper intermediate. Now, of course, because of my previous experience, redoing that path to upper intermediate to advanced doesn't take as long as it did the first time, for example. But I have found with Mandarin Chinese that because I've had to take big gaps learning it, that my progress has been very staggered, very stop-start, and having to, you know, go over previous steps a bit at times to sort of regather what I'd learnt during previous stages to a point. Now, so the reason I mention that is because, you know, the question, how long does it take to learn a language? It's been 5 years since I started learning Mandarin Chinese, and, you know, for example, recently I've been wanting to get back into learning it after having not been able to spend time actively learning it for quite a while. And so I'm now working towards, you know, taking the HSK 6 exam this year, not because I have particular goals with that exam in mind, but I'm using that exam as just a motivation, extra motivation to prioritise actively learning Mandarin Chinese this year. So, you know, if I do that, that will have meant taking, 5 years to get to, well, HSK 6 is considered, I guess, a B2 level, not C1 really, but in the process I'm hoping to get towards C1 by, you know, as I say, following the fundamental principles for language learning. The exam itself is more just a motivational tool for me in my situation. But yeah, just to give you a detailed example of how, you know, each language learning journey is unique and loads of different factors go into it. And just a final thing on that, on finding enough time, the reason I was so stop-start with Mandarin Chinese is I found that because of the amount of differences with English, again, thinking of the characters and tones specifically, I would find that even if during a certain period of time I probably did have, say, 10 minutes spare each day for actively learning Mandarin Chinese, I would choose not to, because I found that it wasn't really enough to make the progress I'd like to with the language during that time. Because of the differences, I'd want a bit more time to actively learn it each day in order to keep building on my progress, in my experience anyway. Now, when learning Vietnamese, it's been a much smoother process in terms of being able to learn it from start to proficiency. You know, my process learning Mandarin Chinese was very smooth in terms of, you know, my approach to learning it, but in terms of the time I had available, it was very stop-start. Whereas with Vietnamese, I started learning Vietnamese from when I arrived in Vietnam, and after 1.5 years learning Vietnamese, so mostly, you know, actively learning it for, say, about a year, and then continuing it with passive learning and practice, and very sort of light active learning, you know, by when reading books, looking up the meaning of words and stuff. I was able to achieve level 5 of the official Vietnamese proficiency exam of the University of Social Sciences and Humanities at the National University in Hanoi. So level 5, well, level 6 is the highest level, so level 5 just below the highest level. So I guess it would technically be like C1 in that sense, because you've got level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2. To be honest, I'd probably say, based on doing the exam and where my level felt at that time, it's probably more, my level was probably B2 more than C1, but, you know, even so, since then, or since learning Vietnamese, I've been able to get to a very high level with it because I've been able to continue learning it throughout that period and build on my progress. And the fact I live in Vietnam helps a lot with motivation, and I get to practice the language, or, you know, very naturally each day as well. Now, on that, one thing I would mention is don't feel you have to live in a country or region where a language is spoken to make fast progress. It obviously can help, but if I hadn't been living in Vietnam and wanted to learn Vietnamese, I could have had that conversation practice with people online, or even if, say, there's a community in my local area of Vietnamese speakers in the local community. So, you know, living in a place where the language is spoken isn't as pivotal as it might seem, even though it can be a big help. Much more important, as I say, is following the key principles for language learning, so passive learning, active learning, and practice. Now, recently, I mentioned my goal for HSK 6 in Chinese this year. As I said, I'm not doing that for the sake of the exam itself, it's more of a motivational tool. But whilst I'm doing that, in order to be able to finally let myself, from a mental standpoint, prioritise Mandarin Chinese, I'm using the HSK 6 textbook that's in Vietnamese so that I can still feel like I'm maintaining and improving my Vietnamese whilst focusing on my Chinese, because as I mentioned, my problem with Mandarin Chinese had been that even though I love learning Mandarin Chinese, it could never be my priority for most of the time because, I'd be learning Vietnamese or I've got significant work commitments at a given time and so on. But I'm hoping this year, once I'm a bit less busy, hopefully, I can focus on improving my Mandarin Chinese whilst still maintaining my Vietnamese. So I'm using, also here you see a book in the bottom picture, which is a series of news articles in Chinese with a corresponding Vietnamese translation. So I'm hoping to continue that this year. Now, in terms of factors that affect individual learning times, it's worth dispelling one, I guess it's almost a myth really, with regard to language learning, and that is that personal aptitude for learning languages is a key factor. It really isn't, honestly. Very often people will say to me, I'm just not cut out for learning languages, or I haven't got a skill for learning languages. It doesn't work like that, honestly. The reason I'm so blunt with that is I don't want it to put you off at all. You absolutely can learn a language. Personal aptitude might play a role in how long it takes you to learn a language, but not a big role. It might mean someone can learn a language a bit faster than someone else, but it shouldn't make a huge difference, and it won't make a huge difference. What's far more important are your situation, your experience, your goals, and your interests, because they're unique to you and will define your language learning journey. And even more important than that, as I've mentioned, is following the fundamental principles for language learning. If you follow those principles, you will be able to reach your goals in the languages you're learning. So, that's just about everything really. Just remember that your journey is unique to you. Don't get too carried away with questions of how long it takes to learn each language. Focus on, if you do want to think about that sort of thing, think about how long they take in relation to one another. That's a far more useful and relevant exercise with that sort of thing. But even then, remember, your language learning journey is unique to you. And if you follow the fundamental principles of language learning and use resources you enjoy, you'll get there. And if you are looking for resources, do feel free to check out our website at howtolearnlanguages.info and our YouTube channel at How to Learn Languages. And if you've ever got any questions, please feel free to email me at contact@howtolearnlanguages.info and I'll get back to you promptly. I'd be more than happy to help. I hope you enjoy learning languages.